What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time continuing our class series ahead of Baldur's Gate 3, this time with the Fighter, a class that excels in various forms of martial combat, all of which we'll be exploring in this video, but we are sticking mostly to the class fantasy, general class mechanics, and we're not getting too deep into the math of these things, as that is better saved for build videos. That said, going into this, Fighter is a very broad term, and as such, it can be a little vague in representing what the class is actually supposed to be. Because if you assume everyone who picks up a stick and tries to hit something with it is a fighter, you would actually be very much so wrong. And because of that, the class has a lot more nuance than it might initially appear. And that brings us to the first section of this video, the class fantasy of a fighter. As I just mentioned, not everybody who picks up a stick is a fighter. In fact, the vast majority of soldiers and mercenaries you might run into in the Forgotten Realms, our world setting, are not actually fighters, because even a level 1 fighter is trained and proficient in all types of martial combat, even though they will go on to specialize in one form in particular. So as a representation of that training, fighters are, by definition, veteran soldiers, military officers, trained bodyguards, dedicated knights, among other things. What really sets them apart is their robust wealth of experience, even from level 1, which is going to be heads and tails above what the common person would have. So when it comes to class fantasy, a lot of what a fighter has to offer, in addition to just their varied and many types of fighting, are where that training actually came from. So where other classes go very specific in where your power comes from and how it manifests, fighters have that option left very much so open. Maybe you got into the adventuring life trying to escape a life in a farm or something. Maybe you received military training as part of some army you were a part of. Or maybe you want to take the Batman route where somebody killed someone close to you and you spent a great deal of time training to take your revenge. All of which would be valid options for creating a fighter. But beyond just the role play of how to become a fighter, it's important to remember that they excel at martial combat in general, and they can specialize in any particular type of it. So whether they're charging into battle with a two-handed weapon or using a more traditional sword and board approach, you can work that into their backstory in some way, because while they are proficient with all of these things, they will specialize in one of them. And because of that, compared to other classes, such as a barbarian who operates on rage and instinct, or a paladin whose martial prowess is augmented by divine power, fighters are just incredibly skilled. They have trained and excel at martial combat to a point where others can only hope to keep up by utilizing sometimes magical means. With that said, let's talk about some of the other information and class mechanics a fighter has to offer, starting with our general information. Ability score wise, you have some options here. Typically, you're going to focus on either strength or dexterity, depending on the types of weapons you're going to be using, or if you want to use a bow. If you want to be an archer, you need dexterity. If you want to use finesse weapons, you need dexterity. Otherwise, you want strength. It's also possible that you might want a little bit of intelligence if we pick up the Eldritch Knight subclass, which allows us to pick up a little bit of magic, but even that would be secondary to strength or dexterity. Constitution's always a good way to go, especially if you're on the front line as well. But your primary ability score is going to be strength or dexterity. From there, however, in terms of proficiencies, you get essentially all of them, all armor, shields, simple, and martial weapons. This is representative of your training with all types of combat. From there, let's talk class mechanics a bit. Starting right at level 1, a fighter has the option of picking one of 6 fighting styles: archery, defense, dueling, great weapon fighting, protection, or two-weapon fighting. These are going to give you a boost to the type of fighting you would like to partake in. So naturally, just pick the one that represents what you actually want to do. These will provide you a decent bonus to that style of fighting. Also at level 1, they pick up Second Wind. This is a free heal you can use once per short rest, which keeps you in the fight that much longer, again representative of your extensive training. Now starting at second level is where things get really interesting, because this is when we get Action Surge. Action Surge is one of the better abilities in 5th edition D&D period. It is what makes a 2-level fighter multi-class useful for almost everyone, and while it's not necessarily the best option at all times, it is universally useful because Action Surge allows you to take an extra action once per short or long rest on your turn. You actually get more uses of this if you were to hit like level 17, but with our level cap of 12, that's not going to come into play. This alone, especially at higher levels, is going to give you the opportunity to make many attacks, and coupled with an already high-powered build, you can do a ton of damage with Action Surge. So while it is, in essence, a very simple ability, never underestimate it. Now at 5th level, like pretty much all martially focused classes, we get our extra attack, allowing us to attack twice every turn. And then last for base class mechanics, we have Indomitable. Starting at 9th level, you'll get to reroll a saving throw that you fail, giving you the possibility of succeeding at it instead. You can do this once per long rest. With our level cap of 12, that will be all, though normally this would also increase as you level up, with the second one actually beginning right at level 13. Now, the rest of a fighter's mechanics come down to their chosen subclass, or their martial archetype. You'll pick this at level 3, and these are meant to be representative of your approach to perfecting your combat style. There will ultimately be 3 of them: Battlemaster, Eldritch Knight, and Champion. Champion is not in early access, so I won't have footage to show you, but Battlemaster and Eldritch Knight very much so are. Battlemaster, I must confess, is a personal favorite of mine, as this gives us access to special combat maneuvers that run off of a resource called Superiority Dice. Right away, we'll learn 3 maneuvers, getting a few more as we level up at 7th and 10th level, all of which use our Superiority Dice. We'll start with 4 D8s that can then turn into D10s at level 10, and we can potentially earn 1 more Superiority Dice at level 7, which would give us a total of 5. Once we use these on our combat maneuvers, they can be restored on a short rest or a long rest, and these ultimately fuel our special maneuvers. These can be all sorts of things, such as pushing attack, which will push an enemy back when you hit them, or riposte, where an enemy will try to hit you, and if they miss, you can use your reaction to use a Superiority Dice to make an attack against them, or something like disarming attack, which will relieve them of their weapons when it hits. In all of these, when you use the Superiority Dice, it will add the roll of that dice to the damage typically, and these maneuvers both add damage and a lot of versatility to what you can inflict as a fighter on the enemy besides just damage. For instance, disarming them and taking away their weapon is an incredibly strong move if it manages to hit. It's also worth mentioning that these maneuvers can also be used with a bow as well, so if you wanted to be an archer and still use Battlemaster, you can very much so do that. But Battlemaster is a really fun way to play the game. Now, as an alternative, you could pick, say, Eldritch Knight, though, which is a more Gish-style character, that is to say, a magic and melee character pushed together to make a sort of battle mage. Eldritch Knights focus on learning a little bit of magic, specifically from Abjuration and the Evocation schools. This is going to allow us to learn some spells from the Wizard spell list, and then of course use them in combat. Now, ultimately though, Eldritch Knights are considered 1/3 casters, which is pretty rare in 5th edition D&D, and as a result of this, if you were to take a fighter all the way to level 12, you would only get 2nd level spells. And because these are wizard spells, they use intelligence as the ability score associated with them. Now, what makes this particular subclass interesting is once you start getting to around level 7, and then again at level 10, we pick up a few class features. Specifically, at 7, we get War Magic, which allows us to, when casting a cantrip as an action, make a weapon attack as a bonus action. And then at level 10, they pick up Eldritch Strike, which causes our weapon attacks when hitting a creature to cause disadvantage on the next saving throws against a spell you cast before the end of your next turn. And depending on the spells you pick and how you want to approach this, they can be a fun way to play, again, a sort of battle mage character while sticking to one particular class and not having to worry about multi-classing into things, etc. That said, then we have our final subclass, which is the Champion. This one is not in early access, and I would be almost surprised if we don't see some sort of small changes to it in Baldur's Gate 3, and that's largely because the Champion is all about maximizing criticals, and they can also pick up an additional fighting style at level 10. But at level 3, and then normally at level 15, they increase the range at which they can perform a critical attack, which is done by rolling a natural 20 normally, but a Champion only has to roll a 19 or 20 right at level 3, or at level 15, this reduces all the way to 18 to 20, which again just makes them able to critically hit more often. But because because their best abilities don't come until after level 12, all they would get in Baldur's Gate 3 is the improved critical at level 3, a bonus to strength, dexterity, and constitution checks that don't already have your proficiency bonus, and the additional fighting style at level 10, which is frankly a little underwhelming. So ultimately, I wouldn't be surprised if they make some changes to Champion for the actual game, but the main thing it does is increase your chance of doing critical hits. The rest of it is all just passive stuff, and in a video game that's not particularly fun. That said, certainly not an archetype to be underestimated, because there is some power in simplicity sometimes. But realistically, I think a lot of people will multi-class into Champion Fighter to level 3 specifically for the improved critical before moving into something like a rogue. That said, with our subclasses out of the way, let's actually start talking about playing a fighter. Your options as a fighter are to basically just to try to hit things, unless you are playing an Eldritch Knight, in which case you'll have some spells available to you, and even then it's usually cast, cantrip, weapon attack, provided of course you've hit level 7, and before that it's still mostly just hitting things. Which means that when it comes to playing a fighter, you're either going to be up on the front lines dealing damage, or potentially playing as an archer and being a bit farther back. It's also possible, of course, to build a fighter as your tank while at the same time dealing some decent damage, and if you're using something like a Battle Master fighter, you can even have the chance to take weapons away from enemies, control the battlefield a little bit through positioning, that kind of thing. So a lot of the gameplay around a fighter is going to amount to things like that, which is a relatively simple play style, but ultimately, I think that's probably best for newer players to the game, which is why fighters retain their popularity despite being relatively simple, because ultimately they are incredibly reliable damage dealers that can be difficult to kill, which makes them especially useful for players new to the game just trying to figure out how everything works, who don't want to have to worry about knowing what each and every spell does, for instance. But beyond just playing a pure fighter, what makes them especially popular is actually their multi-classing, because as I mentioned, 2 levels in a fighter multi-class will get you access to Action Surge, which is universally useful. However, just going 3 levels into fighter can then take you into, say, a Battle Master archetype, which can give you access to your special maneuvers and superiority dice, which combined with Action Surge could add a lot potentially to another martially focused class. But you could also pick up Champion for the extra crit range. And all of that together makes fighters the epitome of simple but effective when it comes to 5th edition D&D. Their class fantasy is straightforward, of course, but very open to interpretation, how you came by your training, what kind of person you are, and mechanics that can deal a very good amount of damage, help you control the battlefield, and learn about the game at the same time. So it's a class that is very beginner friendly, but very, very useful for veterans who know how to make the most of it. So while it can absolutely seem like a class that is just prone to hitting things, the skill ceiling for this is really about using the fighter to control the battlefield. In any event, though, fighters personify martial excellence in a way that just about everyone else needs magic to keep up with. That said, that's been our look at the fighter in the upcoming Baldur's Gate 3. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned a thing or two. So don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But more than anything, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.